Hi, I'm Sarah and I've started on a new career path as a bench joiner. I used to work in IT, which seems quite a change, but I've always liked a variety of things. I've always been quite practical, and at some point I decided working at a desk was no longer for me and I wanted to do a more practical career. I'm currently working as a shop fitter, a bespoke cabinet maker, and I'm at college as well doing a diploma in joinery. I quite like the use of hand tools, and I've been following the video channels of a couple of British joiners using hand tools such as Paul Sellers and Mitch Peacock, and I'm inspired by those and just by the things I would like to make myself, and in my own spare time I've decided to work on some projects. The first project I've made was a birthday present for my mum, which was a thimble cabinet. She's collected thimbles for many years, and years ago my granddad made a selection of thimble cabinets for her, and they've got individual compartments and they're baize lined at the bottom with a sliding perspex panel, and they're dovetail jointed top and bottom with a plywood back, and the original wood was ramin, and I think ramin was used for the edges and pine used for the compartments. But ramin is endangered now, and so not easy to obtain. So I spent a bit of time trying to find a suitable alternative, and I looked at the grain and the colour, and I chose Idigbo, which is a fairly good match. It's not the easiest to work with. It splits slightly, and it discolours when it's glued. And people have told me it smells when it's cut, but I didn't notice that myself. So to start with, I obtained enough Idigbo of two different sizes. The edges are 10mm and the compartments are 6mm. So for the outer panels, I cut everything down by hand. I used a panel saw to cut the strips, and then I planed them all to size. I did one at a time. And then when I did the interior compartments, I used a jigsaw to cut those out, having proved that I could do it all with hand tools, but I still planed them all to size. So the first thing I did was cut the outer panels, top and bottom, side and side, and I put my dovetails in. Single dovetail top and bottom to match the original. I made sure they were the way round to resist weight from the outside, from the top and bottom. So the main tail of the dovetail is on the side piece and the hole's on the bottom. And I did them flush to fit rather than doing them over and cutting down, so I just had a tiny bit to plane down. I used the skills I'd learnt in college. As you can see on this one, as I glued it, it blackened the Idigbo slightly, so I've sanded off as much as I can, but it runs through, so that's a slight mark. It's because the first time I glued that one it didn't have quite enough glue, so I put glue back in and it's got on the outside. So a slight improvement for next time, but the rest of them I'm quite happy with. To make the groove around the main panels, I used my granddad's old plough plane. So I clamped each piece in a portable workbench, and I used the plough plane to run a groove. For the top and the bottom piece, it's actually a stopped groove because the panel runs all the way to the end and I didn't want a groove showing. So the combination plane doesn't work ideally for that, because the whole principle is you've got a blade, like a guide blade or guide plate, running out the bottom and into which the iron sits. And as you cut down the groove, the blade follows the iron follows the blade. But if you don't run all the way to the end, the blade can't get down the groove. So you can get to about here. So I just had to neaten it off with a small chisel. And the same on the bottom. On this side, the groove can run the entire length of the panel, so that one was easier. And on the fourth side, that's shorter, so it didn't need a groove because that's where the perspex slides in and out. Next I took the plywood back, and I say I was following the original design, so it's pinned down, there's no joint on the back. And next were the compartments. These were 6mm, so once I had 7 uprights and 3 shelves, I clamped them together. Oh, well, I marked one out with a combination square and a sharp pencil all the way around and all the way along, and I clamped them together so that all my cuts would be in the same place. And they're halving joints, so I cut to halfway, marked it with the marking gauge. And on the uprights I clamped 7 together, same thing. Did the cut in from the other side, I marked everything so I knew where I was cutting, and then I put them all together. I made sure the cuts were quite tight, so I had to do a little bit of manoeuvring. But once they were all together, they were a very nice fit, and I popped them all in. I had to slightly sand off the edges. One of my other slight flaws is this one here has a slight gap at the front. All the others are flush though, so I don't think that's too bad for a first effort. Next I had to make all the dowel pins, and I tried to invent a jig so that I could sand them all together. Maybe use a pencil sharpener and hold the dowel in a drill, or hold the dowel in the drill and use sandpaper over the end. But whatever I tried, the dowel just fell over. So in the end I did them by hand, and I have a shooting board so I can get everything at 90 degrees and run my block plane along the edge of the dowel. So I squared off the ends, and then I cut them to 12mm, and then I just used a bit of sandpaper, first rough then smooth, and I sanded by hand each one and then smoothed them off. And I had number 1 out as a reference, and every time I completed the next one I compared it to check they looked similar. So that took quite a while for 32, but I got there in the end, got into a bit of a rhythm watching my iPad whilst I did so. So next I had to glue those down, but before I could work out where to glue them, I had to take the base square. So I bought some adhesive backed green base as per the originals, and I cut each one individually because each of these compartments is very slightly different. They're all 34 deep, so I cut a strip and then I cut them all, numbered them on the bottom. And then when I was ready to glue the dowel, I held each of the green bays in loosely, put a spot of glue on the bottom of the dowel, stuck it in place, and let the base just lift up so it didn't get stuck on the glue, and waited for it all to dry. And I glued them all in that way. When I was finished, I checked that the dowel was that they were all stuck well. 3 I took off and restuck, so they should all be at least solid enough to rest thimbles on now. Next, with everything in place, I put in the hangers. Once again, the same as the originals, just 2 drill holes. I made sure they'd fit a standard size 4 screw. So I drilled 1 hole out, another hole up above, and then I just used a small file to smooth the edges and get rid of the burrs off the front and back. I cut the perspex to size on a table saw and sanded the edges, and then I made a personalised button. The old ones had little bits of perspex, but I thought I'd use a small scrap of iDigbo, and that's my initials, SCC. I've since refined my logo, so this is a one-off unique logo. And that runs in and out of here. So all that was left to do now is to varnish and to stick the bays down. Now I don't really have any experience with varnish, and I made a few mistakes here. The very first coat I put down, I didn't smooth off all the drips at the back, so inside the compartments on the ply back there were a few drips at the edges. I noticed this for later coats, and I was very careful to mop any up and not put it on so thick, but the damage was done. So it's a little bit rough, but once the thimbles are all in it won't be noticed. So after 2 coats I sanded it down with some 240 grit just lightly, particularly on the edges where you pick it up, and it came out very well. I ran as carefully as I could. I around a bit of sandpaper inside here, but it's incredibly difficult to fit into a 38 by 32 gap. So there wasn't so much I could do there. So I know what I'd do differently next time, but I'm still quite happy with the finish. And I did that. I did all the rest of the work at my house, in my little workshop in the kitchen which I've made, and the varnishing I did in my dad's workshop in his garage, which is where I am now whilst I came down for Christmas. So varnish done and each coat thoroughly dried, I just had to stick in the green baize which I'd already cut to size. So each piece I popped in, my finger's just small enough to go around behind each one and stick it down firmly, and it sticks quite well. And this piece along the edge, I left the varnish to dry for a few days. This underneath the baize, where the baize goes, I just put 2 coats, and then I left that for about a week so that all the chemicals in the varnish wouldn't melt the solvents in the glue on the back of the baize. So they seem to have stuck well. And then that was it. So compared to the originals, each one of the originals was very slightly different. So the aim wasn't to get it identical, but certainly to match. So the sizing is very, very similar. The colouring, not bad. Ramin darkens with age, so I suspect the Idigbo will change slightly as well. But a very good match, I would say. I'm very pleased with it. I'm looking forward to moving on to my next projects, which are some Christmas presents I promised, but got held up behind some other things I was making. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this little video describing how I made the thimble cabinet. I'm hoping this is the first video of many. I intend to do one for every project I make. This being the first project, I didn't think about it until the end, so it's just a description of how I made it. But future projects I intend to show the working, the full project, so how I make each part and put it all together. I hope you've all had a lovely Christmas. If anyone else has anything to share that they've made, please put a link in the comments.